Good evening, dear beloved community. It's so wonderful to be together with everyone again on this, the 26th day of September in the year 2021. There are so many threads that want to come together in tonight's weaving, so we'll see how we go. Lately, I've been noticing that a lot of friends are not feeling okay. And it's okay to not be okay. If we know how to not run from that, then that can be the starting point of our real journey. And the real journey here, as I've shared before, is not a journey to somewhere in particular or to get something that we think we don't already have. It's not the journey that we normally think of, the frantic sprint away from discomfort to some imagined shore of happiness. The real journey consists in mainly letting go of things. Not necessarily physical things, but mainly our views, our ideas, our notions. And this is so counterintuitive to our usual transactional way of approaching things. And we bring this transactional mentality often to our meditation practice. We practice in order to get something, or sometimes to get rid of something. So much efforting. But what if I told you that the practice is not about getting rid of anything and not about getting anything at all? Rather, it's about letting go of stuff to realize what's been there all along in plain sight. Often the catalyst or starting point of our journey is suffering, emotional, physical, and so on. And whilst the starting point of our journey is the recognition of the pain that we hold individually and collectively, hopefully it's not the end. Well, it's already a great thing if we recognize our pain. I think we should congratulate ourselves if we do that. But there's more to discover. By acknowledging our pain, we begin to recognize its sources, and we begin to notice well-being, ease, and joy, as well as what brings it about. And then we're faced with a choice, not only once in our lives, but 1,000 times a day. What do I want to nurture in my heart and my mind? This is the meaning of the Buddha's final recorded words. Work out your own liberation with diligence. Now, diligence is great. Diligence is important. But often we've turned our diligence into a dry and joyless thing. Diligence is the capacity to keep working your edge, wherever that edge might be in this moment. Becoming curious about why your edge is there in this moment, why you're a little uncomfortable, and then being willing to fail over and over and over again. Because often it's when we fail, when the bottom drops out of our bucket, that true insight has the opportunity to arise. For me, honestly, I don't want to be a so-called advanced practitioner. I don't even want to be a so-called good one. I want to be a beginner the whole of my life. I want to be real. I want to experience each moment with a sense of delight that occurs when it's the first time. And hopefully, in that process, be of some benefit along the way. So my invitation to you today is to be willing to do your work. Actually, not. First, be willing to show up for your work. Your work is when you're touched by something, when you're angry, when you're confused, when you're uncomfortable, when you're happy. And to look into those and understand their roots. And also to notice and become interested in when you're not touched by something, and to understand or come to an understanding of why that is. And then to be willing to embark and remain on this journey of discovery for the whole of our lives. Your work, our real retreat, is right in the heart of our lives just as they are. Waking up, drinking a cup of tea, opening the windows, sweeping the floor. These can be meaningless or the most profound things that we've ever done. It's up to us. We have been well trained, very well trained, and well conditioned to be distracted and to be running after things, ideas, and positions. We're very well trained to not be powerful. Why am I speaking about this? This is not today's topic, but it is what it is. By the way, I love to read the comments under my talks on YouTube. It's not that I have a lot of time to do that, but occasionally I will read the comments. And not so long ago, a person posted under one of my talks and said, Brother Fabhai begins speaking about the actual topic of the Dharma talk at such and such a time. I forget what the timestamp was, something like 29 minutes or something. You're welcome. And I smiled at that because that not only was it funny and true, but it's also our usual tendency in many areas of our life. How about this month we make the commitment to find the real teaching, the real Dharma, in the overlooked, the unexpected, maybe even the neglected places of our heart and of our life. Here in Mountain Spring, slowly the spring is coming, very slowly, but it's coming. And when I see the flowers and the green leaves of spring, I'm reminded of one line in the transmission poem of Insight that I wrote in 2003, spring 2003, to receive the lamp. With every breath, every step, spring returns in countless fragrant blossoms. The practice of mindfulness brings us to life and creates the conditions for what's most true and what's real to bloom within us. We speak of the practice in terms of planting and nourishing seeds. Seeds need to put forth roots in order to receive nourishment to grow. The same is true for us. What are your roots? What are the sources of nourishment in your life and in your heart? This is a really important reflection for each one of us. Around the year 1999, Tay gave many talks to the monastic community on putting down roots and shared with us the product that he used at that time to help plants to generate roots in the hermitage when he was planting trees and flowers and so on. It was called Root On. And after he shared a series of talks about developing roots and sharing about this product called Root On, he called those of us who were not born in Vietnam to have a cup of tea with him. And he shared with us that what he most hoped was that we would enter the tradition, understand why things were the way they were, and then to have the courage to keep renewing Buddhism, to make it relevant to our time, to our culture and the place that we live. And this is a constant process. It's not something that occurs only once and then it's done, but it's a constant process first and foremost within our heart, within our mind. And only when we engage in that work of applying insight to our lived experience, to our everyday life, can we begin to look at the externals. If we're only focused on the externals, we're never really going to get anywhere, just more tangled up. What it means is to allow the practice of mindfulness not to be something that we do, something external, but rather an expression of who we are. Just like when we put tea leaves in warm water, what was once separate has now changed the nature of the other. Water has at some indefinable moment become tea. No one puts tea leaves in a pot, adds hot water, and then asks you if you want a cup of hot water. In the same way, we bring this quality of curious attention to each and every moment of our lives just as they are. And we cultivate this energy of attentiveness. And when it's carefully cultivated, it becomes our natural response. Speaking of tea, a few weeks ago I had a surgical procedure. When I returned to Mountain Spring after the surgery, all I wanted was a cup of tea. I'll never forget that feeling of just wanting a cup of tea. So I filled the kettle with water and I turned it on to boil. I was feeling a little tired, perhaps the residual effects of the anesthetic. So I sat down and I placed my head on the table. The next thing I knew, more than an hour had passed by. So I stood up and I turned the kettle on again and placed some tea in the teapot. And then I dozed off again. When I finally got around to drinking the cup of tea, it was a happy moment. It was a profound accomplishment. So it's a profound accomplishment to inhabit our moment by moment experience, to let the Dharma, the truth, your Dharma, be the way that you move through the world and look at your mind and heart and your experience, gently transforming your mind and heart, and not some dry set of techniques or a collection of information that you got from books or talks like this one or somebody else that is not the Dharma. Speaking of mindfulness practice, often people refer to meditation. The original Pali word for that is often translated as meditation, bhavana, means mental training or cultivation. It doesn't actually mean meditation in the usual sense we have in English. Bhavana, mental cultivation, mind training, is an active and interesting process. When we speak of meditation, we're actually developing 3 interconnected skills which are collectively called the meditators toolkit. The first tool is learning to stay with the object of our attention. As I shared earlier, we have been well trained to be distracted, and many of us have diligently cultivated that skill, the skill of doing 7 or 8 things at the same time. Planning out our whole day, reading the headlines, chatting with family members, responding to emails and texts, all while eating our breakfast. In fact, our society rewards and encourages this kind of multitasking. In meditation, however, we're actively cultivating quite a different skill, monotasking, focusing our attention on one thing at a time, not only directing to one thing, but being aware of what the object of our attention is and what the interaction between our mind and the object of our attention brings about. Given that we have a propensity towards multitasking, we've got to be very loving and compassionate towards ourselves in the initial stages of developing the skill set of staying. Since we might notice that as we begin to develop this skill of learning to stay, we'll be carried away almost continuously. When we recognize we've been carried away, if we can relax and accept that reality and then gently return our attention back, perhaps to the simple but subtle awareness of the physical sensation of our in-breath and out-breath, then over time we develop the capacity to rest, to remain present with no struggle at all. And the second tool in the meditators toolkit is called recognizing. This is cultivating the capacity to recognize when we've drifted away. Often we'll be carried away by a mental narrative without even recognizing that we've been pulled away. How many times have you sat down to practice meditation and said, right, this is the one. All the other meditations were just leading up to this point. We grit our teeth. We have this aspiration, I'm going to be enlightened in this meditation. And we feel like we're going to practice like our hair is on fire, assuming that we have any hair. The bell is invited for the meditation. And the next thing we know, the next thing we're aware of is that the bell's being invited to conclude the session, and we realize we haven't been present for anything at all. We've been thinking about what's going to happen next week, or the shopping list, or any number of things. Maybe even where we're going on holiday. In fact, there was a funny joke that somebody sent me a few weeks ago. And it was the picture of a floor plan of a house. It had a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, a bedroom, and so on. And the caption of the picture read, "Too many options to choose from for my vacation. Hashtag lockdown 2021. That's kind of our situation in Sydney and in Australia in general. So be kind, have a sense of humor, and don't be too tough on yourself. If you're tough on yourself, we're not going to get very, very far. If you've got a playful attitude, you laugh at yourself, and you're willing to be an absolute beginner the whole of your life, then that's enough. As meditators, we want to develop the capacity to place our attention where we want it and have it remain there. I want to be very clear here once again, hopefully. The Buddha didn't teach mindfulness in the sense of just being generally or vaguely aware. He taught appropriate attention, developing the capacity to direct our attention to objects of attention that nurture what we most want to see within us. That which we continually attend to grows stronger in our mind stream and then in our lives. I know people, and so do you, who've allowed anger and resentment and fear to become the predominant stream. Attending appropriately here means to understand the transformation that we want to manifest in our lives and in the world, and then to direct our attention to sense objects, to ideas and interactions which are in line with that aspiration. Recognizing when we've drifted off, both in our meditation and in our daily life, is a crucial skill. The third tool in the meditator's toolkit is called returning. This third tool is nurturing the capacity to return our attention to an object, our breath, for example, an object of attention, or a flower, a conversation, a step, our food, without blaming ourselves for our mind having wandered off or getting caught up in a narrative. Of course, we need to recognize and accept that our mind has this tendency to continually run here and there. And so developing the skill of returning takes time. As we engage in developing these tools, over time they become natural, since they're actually innate within us, but they need to be relearned and cultivated in a way. If we want to learn to play the piano or another instrument, we need to develop the skill set for it. Very few of us are natural prodigies like Mozart. We first need to learn the scales. It's the same with meditation. It might take a little time, but please don't think that meditation begins only when we've mastered these skills. Instead, we show up for what is without judgment. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. We all have our innate and learned patterns of response. And as we cultivate this quality of attentiveness to what is, we begin to recognize these patterns and then see more clearly the patterns that lead us to more freedom and those that cause us and those around us pain. Once we see this, then a different response becomes possible. In a sense, we could call this cognitive restructuring. Rather than focusing all of our attention on what's wrong in a person, in a situation, or in ourselves. We're such experts on this. While recognizing that people, situations, emotions, and so on are complex, we choose to consciously direct our attention to what's beautiful and nurture that attentiveness. We see this practice in one of the foundational texts in the Plum Village tradition, the 5 ways of putting an end to anger. And in that sutra, we're clearly and helpfully invited to notice where we're putting our attention. And whilst seeing the totality of a person or a situation and the complexity, to recognize our tendency to focus on all the ways that the other person should be fixed. Or in the case in which we have anger directed towards ourselves, all of the ways that we think we should be fixed. That which we pay attention to grows stronger. So at the 24-minute mark, we begin the topic of tonight's talk. At its most fundamental level, Buddycitta, the mind of love, the unconditional friendliness that we explored in our previous talk, means to choose over and over again not to give up on yourself, to not give up on someone else, and to not give up on a situation. Even the most hopeless situations or most hopeless parts of yourself. For a while there in the US, trucker hats were really popular. They were super popular. They might be still popular, but it's been a couple of years. Things go through phases. There was a ukulele fad for a while, and that passed. Something else now. But the trucker hat thing went on for a couple of years there. And one time, there was a friend on retreat at Deer Park who had a hat that read, "Keep on trucking." And that attitude, that mindset, is the basic mindset of cultivating this unconditional friendliness, to keep on trucking, keep on going, no matter what. In my last talk, I introduced the first contemplation, recognizing what other beings give birth to in us. And the second contemplation, what we give birth to in ourselves and in others. I wonder how this practice went for you. Once we recognize our intimate and innate interconnection with others and with everything, naturally our attention begins to be directed to the many ways that we're cared for and supported. Believe it or not, it was Einstein who once said 100 times a day, I remind myself that my inner and outer life depend on the labors of others, both living and dead, and that I must be able to exert myself in order to give in the same measure as I have received and I'm still receiving. The next in the 7 practices of cultivating this fierce kindness is called remembering the kindness of all. I love the word remembering. This is one alternative translation of sati, which we normally translate as mindfulness. Sati can also mean coming back together, reuniting all the various parts of our being, and this is one of the functions of mindfulness. The next step in nurturing this seed of bodhicitta, this mind of love, is recognizing the kindness that others offer to us. For many of us, it's actually a challenging step in the meditation. And by meditation here, I don't mean just what you do on the cushion. That's actually, in a lot of ways, not the majority of our life, and therefore not the most important moment of our day. I'm referring to the mind frame that you actively cultivate and inhabit, because we have a tendency to focus on all of the ways that we and others don't live up to our expectations. You know, it's quite hard to find a person who has only perfect qualities. We're human beings. We're all works in progress. What would it take for us to be okay with that? The invitation of this contemplation is to recognize our tendency to focus on the negative, on what's lacking, and to redirect our attention to what's being done for us in each and every moment. In this process, we don't ignore the shortcomings and faults of ourselves or others. We recognize the complexity of the human experience, but we actively cultivate the capacity to focus on the kindness, because just focusing and thinking about and obsessing about the faults of ourselves and others will water that tendency towards negativity that we've been mentioning. And that's not going to be very inspiring. So we acknowledge the shortcomings, but we also examine honestly whether these are actual shortcomings or maybe projections on our part. We have this calligraphy that's very famous in Plum Village, "Are you sure?" And then we practiced with that for a while, and Tay told us if you practice reflecting and asking yourself, "Are you sure?" and the answer is sure, you should ask yourself, if you're sure, check again. The Buddha said all of our perceptions are wrong perceptions. Now Tay at one point said, "I have a lot of compassion, so I'll say 99% of your perceptions are wrong perceptions." So most of the things that we see, we perceive, we think about ourselves or others, they're incomplete. If we recognize that the shortcomings we think that we or another person has are not the complete picture, then as we take this practice, this contemplation on board of recognizing the kindness, remembering the kindness, then we let them go and we focus instead on the good qualities they possess, even if they're just tiny, like the tiniest little bit of goodness we can see at this moment in time. But we choose to focus on that and nurture that. We meet the person where they're at and we nurture that quality, even if it's really small. It might be really big, but even if it's really small. In this way, of course, we're being a good mother, a good parent to others. We're actively nurturing the helpful qualities, but also nurturing those qualities in ourselves. It can be a beautiful contemplation to reflect back on our day and to consider what we've received from others today. The things that we receive are not only physical things, which are of course important to recognize, but also maybe a person listened to us, smiled to us, looked us in the eyes, and so on. If we look deeply, the situation we currently enjoy is thanks to so many from limitless time. As a monastic, I might have a bit of an easier time with this, since everything that I have, every single thing that I have comes from the generosity of others. However, even if we're not monastics, still everything that we have in our life has come to us through the contributions of so many. Some of us might have difficulties recognizing the kindness of another person here. So I have a practice I'd like to recommend. Once you've practiced reflecting back on your day in general, and you've begun to water that awareness, that neural pathway of noticing what you've received today, then bring to mind a specific person and perhaps go through periods of your life, a month for example, and list out, whether just in your consciousness or on a piece of paper, but list out and feel with your body all the kind things that that person has done for you. Feel when you recognize that kindness, the ways that they have supported you. Feel how that feels in your consciousness, in your body. Especially if we have problems in that relationship, this practice can put things in perspective. Many years ago, in the monastic community, I was having an issue with somebody. Now, sometimes people think, oh, living in the monastic community, it's a utopia. Now, of course, we all have a similar aspiration. We all have our practice of the 6 harmonies and things, but we also live together 365 days a year, 24 hours out of 24, and so on. So things arise. We're all human beings. And I was having an issue with somebody. That person behaved in a way that I perceived was really unkind. And so I thought, right, this was about 12 years ago now. I thought, right, everything that person's given to me, I'll put in my room, I'm going to return to them. I don't want that person's things in my place anymore. So I got a little box, a shoe box, and I started to put the things that that person had given me or let me borrow into that shoebox with the intention of putting it into their room. And as I was doing this, I noticed that one shoebox wasn't enough. There was more than one shoebox, and it was a really powerful practice to simply go around and think of getting rid of all of these things, and then to notice all of these physical things that that person had given me, tea and so on, that really contributed a lot to my life. And as I was doing that and seeing all the things that person gave me, already my perspective started to change. And then I began to reflect on all the kind things that I'd received from that person. And as I did that, my perspective completely shifted. And I realized it was just this tiny little blip. But in fact, that person had behaved so kindly to me for 99.99999% of the time. And it was just this one little moment. And then I started to think, maybe, it was just an unfragrant encounter. Who knows what that person might have been going through at that moment in time. And so my heart, my consciousness completely changed. And I was able to reach out in connection. And it really was just one of those blips. So this practice can be a very powerful practice, especially if we've experienced a relationship as problematic. It's also an especially strong antidote to the depression that we sometimes feel when we think, oh, nobody cares about me or nobody loves me. When we go through this practice of recognizing all of the kindness in a period of time, it puts things in perspective. So the second of the 7 steps is to remember the kindness of all of our mothers, all living beings. The next step in the contemplation naturally emerges from this one. If we truly see what we've received and are constantly receiving from others, then our heart wants to respond, and we begin to ask ourselves, I'm receiving so much. What am I offering back in support? In cultivating this quality, I found it helpful to use a similar framework to the meditation I shared earlier on remembering the kindness we've been shown. Again, we go through periods of our life and examine in what ways we've shown kindness back to others, the moments in which we've opened our hearts. Honestly, every time I've done this, something interesting has happened. At first, when I practiced this contemplation, I felt that I was receiving so much and I was giving back so little. For a while, I thought like, wow, I'm just like a sponge. I'm receiving so much and I'm not really doing anything kind or supporting anybody else very much. And I thought, wow, other people are so kind, and me, not so much. But then I got interested in that reaction. I'm the kind of person that when something like that happens, I don't just stop there. I'd get interested in why I have that response, that reaction. And so I continued to meet that edge in my consciousness when I notice it arise. And as I continued the contemplation, something interesting happened. I keep using interesting because I find meditation interesting. I do it because I enjoy it and I discover something new every time. I began to see that perhaps this perception that I had of other people doing so much and me myself not doing very much might not be the full story. In fact, perhaps even without knowing it, maybe I've offered some support to others. Who knows? Maybe by just looking a person in the eye or smiling at them, I might have given them the courage to go through the day. And so I began to recognize this tendency that we have towards putting down our own goodness. And I began to see that we can never quite know what we mean to others. In fact, to see ourselves through another person's eyes. And this is really one of the hidden aspects of this particular contemplation, to begin to see how we're actually deeply treasured. And this can be very healing. One day, many years ago, I was on a special retreat. It was a weekend retreat, and in that retreat, each of the retreatants had a sponsor who secretly contacted key people in the retreatant's life and asked each of them to write the retreatant a letter sharing how precious the retreatant was to them and how much we had touched their lives. Each of us received a pouch with letters in it from key people in our lives telling us how important we were to them. I would love to do that retreat again. It was so wonderful, such a beautiful experience to receive all of these surprise letters and to see ourselves through each other's eyes. The one that we're hardest on, actually, is ourselves. And as a fruit of this contemplation, we become more aware of the impact of our actions, and we become alert to the possibility of opening our heart to support others, rather than habitually closing down and thinking that we're not good enough or that we have nothing to offer. I find that this adaptation to the meditation that I just outlined is very helpful in my own experience for moving our hearts so that we actually feel something, this warm-hearted quality of friendliness towards ourselves and to the world around, and we begin to be able to open up and receive that kindness, that friendliness which is shown to us. But for now, let's receive a sound of the bell. In terms of repaying the kindness, as many of you have requested, I've decided to offer again the series of talks on the 8 realizations. This moment in which our attention is directed towards Afghanistan feels like the perfect moment in which to honor all of those from Afghanistan and regions around Afghanistan who have worked so hard to offer us these precious teachings. So over the next few months, in addition to continuing on with these practices of cultivating Buddycitta, in my talks, I'll also offer talks on the discourse on the realizations, the 8 realizations of great beings, roughly following the newly released book. And then in our monthly book club, we can discuss the chapter and that the talk was based on. And also our monthly meditation and discussion themes in the Compassionate Ocean Sangha will follow along with the realization that we're contemplating through the month. I won't be sharing everything that's in the book. Perhaps I'll bring out a few main points here and there, but I might also share things that are not in the book as well. So let's see what happens. Many of you will have seen the few talks that are on YouTube that were recorded when I first began to offer these teachings, I think about 4 or so years ago now. I even had a PowerPoint presentation that I used to do. This time around, I'm not going to be offering the PowerPoint. I'm going to be sharing from the heart. I'm going to be sharing these teachings in quite a different way than I did back then. In the Plum Village tradition, we have a chanting book that has a number of key texts that we read every day. If you come to one of our practice centers in the morning, in the evening, we read some texts. We chant them together. Now, the edition of the book that we have these days is very thick. It's hundreds of pages. But in the 1990s, it was a simple pink spiral-bound book with just a few texts and recitations. The Heart Sutra, the Discourse on Happiness, the 8 Realizations of Great Beings, and so on. I like to think of that little pink book as Plum Village unplugged and unadorned. And I consider those texts in that book to be the core texts of Plum Village. There were so few texts in that book that we read the same sutras, the same texts and recitations over and over and over again. And those few sutras and texts entered my mind stream in a way. When I'm struck by a sutra or a line in a text or a teaching or some inspiration or a practice, I sit, I walk, I breathe with it as if it was a friend on the path for some time. Sometimes days, maybe years, allowing it to sink deeply into my mind stream and using the lens of that practice or the insight or the perspective that it provides as a framework to reflect on my own life and on the world around. And every single time I've allowed myself to practice with a practice or a teaching or an insight in this way, I've been surprised by the discoveries that have emerged. So a few years ago, that sutra on the 8 realizations of great beings began tapping me on the shoulder. Tay valued this sutra a lot. However, honestly, I didn't share that feeling at all in the beginning. To say that my attraction to this sutra surprised me is the understatement of the century, since for many years of my monastic life, I didn't understand the appeal of this sutra at all. There's no poetry, there's no great story of celestial and heavenly bodhisattvas and mystical beings and so on. Truthfully, I'd have to say, just between us, that I found the Sutra of the 8 Realizations of Great Beings completely boring. And dare I say it, basic. It was almost like reading a shopping list. I remember as a young novice stoically enduring the recitation of this sutra many times. I developed what I like to consider to be an almost Pavlovian response to this sutra. I would close my eyes and slip into unconsciousness whenever I would hear the first line, wholeheartedly day and night. And then I would wake up and breathe a sigh of relief whenever I heard the final words of the sutra, dwelling forever in peace. There was like a big when I came to that final line. Now, as I shared earlier, I'm the kind of person that becomes curious about my own reactions and responses. So when I noticed this, I began to look into this text and its origins. Now, I'll be the first person to say that I'm probably not the sharpest student. But for many years, I was completely mystified as to why this particular sutra, out of all of the other awesome possibilities, Avatamsaka Sutra and so on, why this sutra has been praised by so many great teachers throughout history. The sutra on the 8 realizations of great beings was so important to our teacher that this was the sutra that he offered to the refugees when he was rescuing refugees on the boat, the Roland, in the 1970s in the South China Sea. In Plum Village, when he was training us, Tay would remind us over and over again to please treasure this sutra. I think it might even be printed in one of the small editions of this sutra in English, one of the early versions. Please treasure this sutra. So with the above background, you'll understand why I was initially seriously unenthusiastic when the sutra on the 8 realizations of great beings kept popping up on my radar. But as I shared earlier, over the years, I've learned to trust when something's tapping me on the shoulder. And so I began reading one insight from the sutra each morning and practicing with it through the day. After practicing for some time in this way, I noticed that each of the realizations was incredibly condensed and that I would discover something new every time I practiced with it and reflected on it. So to give each realization more time to unfold in my mind and more importantly in my life, I decided to practice with one realization each week. And I had a similar experience. Later on, I found that what worked best for me was to sit, to walk, to breathe, and to eat with each realization for about a month at a time. And this led me on an amazing, multifaceted journey of discovery, just a few aspects of which I'm going to share with you over my next few talks. And I hope it'll be an inspiration for you to fall in love and treasure this sutra. It's truly a treasure of insight, and it's presented in an extremely condensed form. As I shared, we'll be practicing with one insight per month in the Compassionate Ocean Sangha. Maybe we'll discover so much in each of the realizations that we'll want to practice with one insight for a year, or maybe one insight for a lifetime. It seems like the right moment now to offer aspects of this teaching again. So over the next few months, we'll be exploring this sutra and more importantly, how to put it into practice. I hope that you'll savor these 8 realizations and let them sink into your body and mind until you experience them welling up from within you. Please don't approach this sutra as if you're rushing through a thriller novel, waiting for the big reveal at the end of the sutra when everything comes together. That's not going to happen. You'll be disappointed. In our practice, the big reveal is in each and every moment. In our practice, the most advanced practices are actually the most simple, the most basic, being able to follow an in-breath and an out-breath. And the deepest insight is also the most simple, the kind of insight that brings us back to what part of us is known forever. There's a familiarity about the most profound insights. You know what? One simple line of teaching, one insight can be enough, more than enough, to practice with for the whole of a lifetime. I was talking with a friend the other day who shared, Phapai, I think there's enough for me to practice with in the first insight. I don't know if I'll get to the other 7. And I think that this was a profound insight. If we understand into being, if we understand the Buddha's teaching, then one thing is more than enough, since it contains everything else. And every insight that we have has a quality of leading onward. So I've got no doubt that this person will go very deep and very far, since by entering one door fully, you'll enter them all. As hopefully we'll discover, the Sutra on the 8 Realizations of Great Beings is not an analytical text or a theoretical commentary. Sorry about that, list lovers. It's a practical and down-to-earth meditation manual. It's a structured and a concrete expression of the steps that we can take in realizing the Buddha's insight for ourselves. Last Sunday, I reminded everyone of something that I feel is very important. I also mentioned it briefly earlier in this talk. I want to share it again now. Books, sutras, and Dharma talks, including this one, are not the Dharma. They are about the Dharma. The Buddha's invitation is for each one of us to discover the truth, the Dharma, right in the heart of our own lives and in our own minds. In the heart of your life, just as it is, the way it is. In this way, the Dharma is no longer an object, some object that's outside of ourselves that we've got to try to cram in a whole lot of information in order to comprehend or hopefully to realize. But it becomes the air that we breathe, the step that we take, and our way of moving through the world. As a monk, I have a daily practice of coming before the shrine and lighting incense and sending good thoughts and well wishes for the well-being of everyone in the area. So not so long ago, I was burning frankincense here in Mountain Spring. And later in the day, I had to go to the post office to collect a package or something. And when I walked into the post office lady said, "Oh, what's that fragrance of the outdoors?" So we let this energy permeate our lives, just like the frankincense permeated my clothes, or maybe even permeated my skin. And in this way, it's not something we do. It's not a collection of information that we force ourselves to memorize. Brother Forhai, can you repeat that thing that you said last week in the talk? But rather, it's the stretching of an arm. It's the way we close the door. The absolutely ordinary moments of our life. In Tibet, there are practitioners who are known as tertons. They're treasure revealers. In a way, my experience of practicing with this text feels a lot like that. I've discovered a treasure that's hidden in plain sight, and it's overlooked by so many. And in the same way that we have the mistaken view that the advanced practices are complicated, and we think that something as simple as following our in-breath and out-breath is for children or for beginners, then the sutra has this tendency. It looks like, from the outside, it may look like it's a very simple text, a text for children. But in this way, if we view it in this way, we have a mistaken view. It's actually an incredibly profound text that takes us from the most basic to the so-called most advanced aspects of the Buddha's insight. I personally would like to invite everybody to be a beginner the whole of our lives. Let's make the vow to begin again and again and again with each breath, with each moment, and let go of the idea actually of some advanced level. If we can do that, we might discover a treasure hidden in plain sight, right in the heart of our ordinary lives. And by our ordinary lives here, I mean your life. I don't mean anybody else's, I mean yours. In this short, concise, and like I said, seemingly ordinary sutra, we're offered a complete overview of the Buddha's path, the insight of the Buddha in seed form, from the most simple understanding to the most profound. It's actually been said by masters that if all the texts and commentaries of Buddhism were suddenly lost, that the entirety of the Buddhist path of practice and insight could be recreated from this one sutra. In this text, the Buddha basically shares with us, this is what I've awakened to. This is the heart of my insight. If you would like to have a similar awakening, then please take on these subjects for meditation and apply them in your daily life. And then you'll discover this insight, this path for yourself. And most importantly, within yourself. I love the fact that in this text, there's a strong emphasis on practice right in the heart of our daily lives. It's something that I've been emphasizing throughout this entire talk. The subjects of meditation presented in this text are not only intended to be contemplated on the meditation cushion, but throughout the entire day. And more importantly, the insights that you gain are to be applied in every moment. The sutra is a kind friend, a great teacher, pointing out instructions for us to walk the way for ourselves right where we are. So I truly believe that this is the moment in which it's time for the insights in this sutra to come to light. Since we like to overcomplicate everything. And let's be honest, mindfulness has become commodified. It's become a set of techniques in order to get something, which is quite counter from the Buddha's original intention. However, we need to take a little historical journey first. And as everybody who listens to my teachings knows, I love to share a little bit about the history of things. In the town that I grew up, there was a historical society. And everybody used to joke about this historical society. Since they used to get really amped up about everything, they would get quite upset and really obsessed about different things. Everybody used to call them the hysterical society. So we'll take a little bit of a historical journey first before we begin our exploration of the text. So as I mentioned above, the first question that I asked myself was, why was this text important to take? And then I began asking questions such as, where did it come from? Who translated it into Chinese and so on? And these questions led me to my first in a series of discoveries. Here it is, prepare to be blown away. The Sutra of the 8 Realizations of Great Beings was translated into Chinese by a Parthian monk whose name was An Shigao, around 140 or 171 of the Common Era. So let's stop here for a moment. Not many of you seem to be as blown away as I was by that information. That seriously blew me away. There are some of you who are probably thinking, An Shigao, blah, 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 when's Papai going to get to the good stuff? Okay, fair enough. He was from the capital of Parthia. So where was Parthia? Parthia was in the vicinity of modern-day Iran and Iraq. Today, An Shigao would most likely have had Iraqi nationality. He was born in a town that still exists. I hope one day it's going to be possible to visit this town. It's called Ctesiphon. It's about 30 kilometers from Baghdad. And he died at the end of his life in about 171 of the Common Era in Suzhou in China. We tend to think of Buddhism nowadays as an Indian or Tibetan or East Asian phenomenon. But Buddhism arose in the north of India, and then 6 centuries later we hear of Master Xuanzang, Master Huinzhang, who traveled from China to India to obtain a full set of the Buddhist canon, the Buddhist texts. Most of us don't stop to consider very deeply, how did Buddhism travel from India to China in those 6 centuries that are not spoken about outside of academic circles? who were the great translators of texts? What actually inspired the Chinese monks 6 or 7 centuries later to travel from China to India to obtain texts? They didn't have mystical dreams about it. How did Buddhism get to China to inspire monks from China to travel to India to obtain texts? Occasionally we hear of great Buddha statues in places like Afghanistan, but they slip from our minds quicker than yesterday's lotto numbers. So in studying the origins of this text, it's essential to have a grasp of what's called Silk Road period of Buddhism. In Plum Village, back when I was a novice, we had just basically one video. We didn't even have DVDs, we had videos. It was a VHS. It was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and we had another one which was Gandhi. So we basically, whenever we would have a movie night, we would either be watching Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs or Gandhi. I think to this day I could probably close my eyes and mouth along with the entire dialogue of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I don't know how those two videos arrived in Plum Village, but that's what we had for quite a number of years. And then about 1998 or so, Tay gave Upper Hamlet a set of videos called The Silk Road, a documentary that was made in Japan on the Silk Road. And I enjoyed that documentary so much. It was amazing. And I mean, mainly because it wasn't Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but Tay was really asking us to learn a lot more about the Silk Road period of Buddhism. And in fact, in the course of my discovery, through this documentary and through later research, we know that Buddhism was well known and it was influential, and it cross-pollinated with local traditions all along the Silk Road, which at its peak stretched all the way from Greece on the Mediterranean shores to China. This is Buddhism not only as a philosophy, but as a lived tradition. There were monasteries and monastics all along the Silk Road. In fact, in recorded history, there were 40 Buddhist monasteries and temples in Kabul, in Afghanistan, and many of us have heard the capital Kabul mentioned in recent weeks. In fact, even in the Buddhist canon, there's a very interesting text. It's a canonical text in Sri Lanka called The Questions of King Milinda. Now, King Milinda is the Greek Emperor Menander who met a Buddhist monk, and the text is about questions that the Emperor Menander asked the Buddhist monk Nagasena. So Buddhism cross-pollinated with traditions, including Christianity. There was also a lot of interesting exchanges between Buddhism and Islam, Buddhism and Judaism, and so on along the Silk Road, but I'll save that for another time. Buddhism is not foreign from our roots. It's as those of us who have been raised in the West. In fact, it's been there for a long time. So, as a very brief overview, Buddhism entered China via the Silk Road beginning in around the 2nd century. And Buddhist monks traveled with merchant caravans along the Silk Road. Buddhism was brought to China by monks who nowadays would be considered as Westerners. They were from Afghanistan, from Kazakhstan, from Turkestan, from Iran and Iraq. In fact, if you go to China or you do your research, you can even find murals of blue-eyed and bearded Sogdian, ethnic Sogdian Buddhist monks who are teaching Chinese monks. This mural from the 9th century can be found in the Thousand Buddha Caves in Western China. So it was actually monastics who nowadays are considered to be Westerners who were the primary teachers and transmitters of Buddhism for about 7 centuries. We brought Buddhism to China and to East Asia. Our ancestors did this work. Buddhism was of such importance that they dedicated their lives to the practice and translation of texts and teachings. So the first documented translation by Buddhist monks in China was around the end of the 2nd century, and An Shigao was the first of about 37 well-known figures from Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Turkestan, Iran, Iraq, and so on, who were active in the transmission of Buddhism to China or the translation of key texts. And as I mentioned earlier, An Shigao was born just outside of Baghdad, and he was a prince who renounced his throne and he became a monk. And he was the one who made the first documented translations into Chinese. He worked to establish Buddhist centers of learning in the vicinity of the modern-day city of Luoyang, and he was the first of a wave of Silk Road Buddhist teachers who brought Buddhism to China and through China to us today. And among his many translations was the 8 Realizations of Great Beings, which was the 2nd sutra translated into Chinese. The first was, of course, the Sutra of 42 chapters, which we'll look into a little further down the road. And so this fact alone underlies the extreme importance of this text. So the core text of the 8 Realizations after the prologue, which we'll touch on to conclude the talk this evening, it's divided into 2 sections. The first realization, the one that my friend said is enough for them, is the first section, and that presents the Buddha's core insights into the nature of reality. So that one insight is basically the Buddha's core insights. And then the remaining 7 insights, the 7 realizations, are concerned with how we should live in the world in order to manifest this insight. So that first insight is this incredibly profound insight, and the other 7 are, this is how to realize that insight in your life. So to conclude this talk and to give us our practice theme for this coming month, since I haven't really spoken about anything much this evening up till now, so I better give something to practice with this month, we'll talk about the prologue, which will help us to understand who the Buddha was speaking to and how we're meant to put this sutra into practice. So in the book coming out this month, I used 3 different translations, 5 if you consider the 2 different Chinese translations that I've incorporated. But today we'll just use Tay's translation, which reads, wholeheartedly, day and night. A disciple, a student of the Buddha, should recite and meditate upon the 8 realizations discovered by the great beings. So most Buddhist sutras begin with the phrase, thus have I heard. And this is usually followed by a mention of where the Buddha was. For example, the Buddha was on Vulture Peak or so on. And then how many people were present. The sutra on the 8 realizations of great beings doesn't. Like me, do you ever wonder, given that the texts often tell us that there were thousands of people present, how they dealt with sound issues? How did the Buddha deal with sound issues? Even in our hall in Mountain Spring here, it's not so massive, but people in the back often say, Brother Fahai, can you speak more loudly? How did the Buddha deal with 1,250 people? We never think about this. People only ever say things like, oh, it must have been supernatural, like the Buddha used some kind of psychic power so that everybody could hear him. Or they say the people in the front whispered the discourses to those in the back, which of course is a beautiful image, until you think to yourself, how well does the game of telephone work? What did the people in the back hear? Does anybody remember that movie Monty Python, The Life of Brian? And there's a scene in that movie, The Life of Brian, where Jesus is standing up on a hill, and I think it's called the Beatitudes or something. And He's talking about blessed is the peacemakers, and people are shouting things like, speak up, speak up. And then somebody says, oh, he said, blessed are the cheesemakers, and so on. It's a very funny scene. We find none of the traditional openings, like thus have I heard, in this sutra. I think this is quite intentional, given the fact that this sutra is addressed to disciples of the Buddha. This heart teaching is addressed to students of the Buddha across all times. That means that this teaching is addressed to us, directly to us, who are reading or hearing these words many centuries later. It's addressed to you, just as if you were sitting in front of the Buddha and receiving a personal teaching from him. The commentary tells us that the teaching of this sutra was prompted by a question asked by Aniruddha, one of the Buddha's greatest disciples. And the story goes that Aniruddha came to see the Buddha and said, how are those of us who are living at home, who are not monastics, supposed to practice in order to be liberated? And the Buddha said, that's a great question. Your question relates to the realizations of great beings, all those who came before and all those who came after. I'll now explain to you what you need to hold in your mind day and night so that you can realize these things for yourself. So that's the origin story that leads into the very first line, wholeheartedly day and night. So before you read the entire text for yourself, might be good to ask, how can we put this into practice? And we get the answer in the very first line, wholeheartedly day and night. And this underlines how practical and down to earth this teaching is. By the way, why do we equate spirituality with transcendence? Somehow rising above our experience, rising above our bodies. If someone asks you, for example, to point to heaven, mostly we'll point up, right? I think it's about time we started pointing down to the earth, down into our lived experience. But that's a talk for another time. We won't go down that road now. I'll just plant that seed. With all of our being, wholeheartedly and at all times, day and night. Not only on the meditation cushion, but right in the heart of our daily life. In the checkout line at the supermarket, when we're at work, not just in certain moments when we're practicing, but in our everyday life, however messy it is. In this very first line, there's a phrase, recite and meditate. A disciple of the Buddha should recite and meditate on the 8 realizations discovered by great beings. There are many layers of meaning, but in the context of our current reflection on the sutra, this refers to balancing meditation, contemplation, and action. It means holding the sutra in our consciousness, holding the insights in our consciousness, contemplating it through the day, but most importantly, putting it into action. Contemplation and practice being like the 2 wings of a bird, both needed to take flight. We're not waiting for some imagined day in the future when we're completely liberated, peaceful, all-knowing, and all-powerful before we bring these realizations off the cushion into our lives. We're never going to be quite ready. That's the nature of life in this samsara world. So we're invited to both contemplate and apply the sutra at the same time, knowing that through this active engagement, internally and externally, layer upon layer of insight will be revealed to us. Day and night here doesn't mean that we stay up all night reciting and meditating on this sutra, although I'm sure that some of you would like to. The phrase day and night means to apply these realizations at all times without exception. In the context of developing mindfulness, Tay often used the phrase in Vietnamese mien mak, which means constantly or continuously without interruption. And there is this same sense in the first line. If you visit any of our practice centers in the Plum Village tradition worldwide, you'll notice that mindfulness is not something that we're encouraged to cultivate only on the cushion. but rather in each moment of our life. It's easy to be carried away though. So every 15 minutes or so, a bell is sounded. And when we hear that bell, we stop whatever we're doing, we come back to our breathing, and we reflect on what is it that I'm doing. Most of us don't live in a monastery, but the practice of stopping is a very important practice that can help us to cultivate this sense of continuity. And so I invite you to use the circumstances of your life, just as they are. Find something, a sound, a sight, and so on, that you see or hear regularly that can help you to stop for a few moments. Maybe when the phone rings, you stop and just breathe in and out 2 or 3 times before answering. Or maybe you hang a nice calligraphy on the wall. The Plum Village app has a mindfulness bell that can be programmed to sound at various intervals, and that's a wonderful resource. But I personally always encourage friends to find a sound or a stimulus that they encounter in their daily life that initially they might consider to be an interruption, and they invite that to be a practice friend. Here in Mountain Spring, we are right next to a main road. It's one of the 2 main roads going over the Blue Mountains this way. It's basically right outside the house here. So sometimes the traffic can be quite loud, but I don't experience it as an annoyance anymore. Every time I hear a car go past, it's just like a sound of the bell to me. I like to use that sound to come back to myself. I have many chances to practice, not only once every 15 minutes. So I invite you to turn whatever's an interruption in your life into an invitation. I invite you, as we begin our time together reflecting on this sutra, reflecting on this invitation of the prologue to practice wholeheartedly day and night with all of our being, to consider what you find supportive in cultivating a continual or uninterrupted practice of mindfulness. What are your personal bells of mindfulness that call you back to your body and to this moment? What in your everyday environment could you use as reminders to constantly cultivate this energy of attentiveness? What does it mean to you to be wholehearted? These are all aspects that are present in this prologue, in the introduction to the sutra. In a few weeks in our book club, we'll be discussing the prologue section of the book and maybe this talk as well. So I wish everybody a very successful practice. It's something to look forward to. And we'll conclude with a sound of the bell.